All right, I hope your week is going well. Today we're going to talk about one of the softer skills, one of the more nuanced skills in coaching and set design. So I received a question about how to either regress sets for swimmers that are struggling or how to progress sets forward for those that are being successful and experiencing success, and how do things move forward over the course of the season. So it's one thing to write a great set, but how do you adjust that for certain individuals and how do you move that set forward? Because obviously, one practice, while people can make progress in that one practice, that's not going to get them to their goals. It's the series of continued progress over a series of practices that really makes the difference, and that's what we need to work on. So one of the big challenges of coaching is not all swimmers are the same. They're going to have different ability levels, they're going to have different skill levels, and they're going to have different levels of fitness. So if you ask everyone to do the same thing, maybe it works really well for a third, maybe it works okay for a third, and maybe it works pretty terribly for the other third. So you have to know how to adjust for certain individuals. But you also can't just write 20 different practices. So you have to have one basic framework and try to make subtle adjustments that allow everyone to be successful. And as we talked about in a previous question and answer, one of the biggest skills that coaches need to be good at is setting things up for swimmers to be successful. And so you want to challenge them enough that they can make progress and improve, but also control that challenge enough so that they can be successful most of the time. So in the context of set development, sometimes you're going to have to adjust sets down a little bit or provide one or two subtle tweaks for certain individuals so that they can be successful. And then also, hopefully, everyone is improving over time. And so you're going to have to take your sets forward as you move through a season. And then even over time as the quality of your group, just because they've gotten more practice, they get better over time, the standards are probably going to go up as well. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go over some of the basic strategies for adjusting sets up, making them more difficult, and then also for adjusting sets down, making them less difficult. Then I'll go over a quick example so that you can kind of see what these concepts might look like in practice. Adjusting sets up. So the first strategy is change the structure of the set. So if you need to make things more difficult, you can reduce the rest periods, you can increase the repetition distances, you can perform more repetitions, or any combination of the above. So simply doing the same basic things, but just doing them in more difficult situations. If you're asking swimmers to do more, it's going to be harder. If you're asking to do the same thing, but for a longer period of time, for instance, doing 150s instead of hundreds, that's going to be more difficult. And if you ask them to do it with less rest, that's going to make it more difficult as well. Any of those are great strategies. You could also ask for better performances. So more speed, more dolphin kicks, fewer strokes, higher stroke rates, any combination of the above. That can make things more difficult as well. It's a great way to make the challenge more significant. You can also add constraints. So if they weren't doing dolphin kicks, now they have to do dolphin kicks. If they didn't have a stroke count, now they have a stroke count. If they didn't have a stroke rate, now they have a stroke rate. If they didn't have a time performance, now they have a time performance they need to meet. So adding those constraints is going to make the set more difficult as well. You can also change the training aids. So for instance, if they weren't using resistance and now some of the repetitions they are using resistance, that's going to make it more difficult. So whenever you're using training aids to make sets more difficult, whatever that aid is should probably make the set more difficult. So taking away resistance probably makes it easier. So you want to add things that make it more difficult. And so you could also take away things that make it easier. So for instance, if they were doing pull with a band and a buoy, you take the buoy away, now they only have the band, that's going to make it more difficult. So you've changed the training aids by taking it away. Likewise, if they were doing a set with fins, take away the fins, don't change the set. That's going to make things more difficult, more likely than not. If they're already using resistance, bump up the resistance. So if they're using a small parachute, use a medium or a large parachute. If they've got a power tower and they've got 1 bucket of water, do 2 buckets of water or add 10 pounds or whatever it is that makes sense for you and the equipment that you're using. Just simply use more resistance if you're already using resistance. It's going to make the set more difficult. And lastly, you can use more difficult training tasks. So if you're using certain drills, you can use harder versions of those drills. They're either more physically demanding or they're more technically challenging. Whatever it is, it's a great way to make the set more difficult without changing the basic structure of the set. And so those are some of the big strategies that you can use to make a set more difficult. You can use any of them, you can use all of them, you can use them in any combination that you want. It doesn't really matter as long as you're working towards your goals. So when adjusting sets down, we're basically doing the opposite of adjusting sets up. So you can change the structure of the set, shorten the distances, reduce the total volume, increase the rest. Those are all going to make the set less difficult for swimmers. And so when you're making that change for the whole group, it's not that big a deal. What does become a little bit more challenging when you're changing the structure of the set is that it's going to create different sets happening at the same time, and they're not happening on the same schedule. So that can be somewhat of a logistical challenge. If you have the time and the space, then you can make that work. If not, then, and you need everyone to be kind of doing the same thing at the same time, so it probably makes more sense to adjust some of the parameters we're going to talk about in a second. However, if you can make it work, it's usually a pretty good fix for swimmers that are struggling. They usually just need a little bit more rest or a little bit less of distance for each repetition, and usually they can make that work. Next one is lower performance expectations. So they don't have to do as many dolphin kicks. They can take more strokes. They can swim at a lower stroke rate, or they can swim slower. You can use any combination. It doesn't really matter as long as you are allowing them to be successful with what you're asking them to do. So for instance, sometimes swimmers are able to hit the stroke count that they want, but they just can't hit the speed for whatever reason. You just kind of lower the expectation to what you want, and then you can get them back on track. Next is to remove constraints. And so this is a situation where if you were asking them to do dolphin kicks, they don't have to do them anymore. If you were asking to do a stroke count or hit a stroke rate or hit a certain time, you remove that constraint. So it's not just lowering it, it's just totally removing it so that they don't even have to worry about it at all. So sometimes that can be a great strategy as well. Change the training aids. So you can either add training aids that make things easier, for instance, perhaps a buoy or perhaps paddles or perhaps fins, depending on the situation. Or you can stop using training aids that make things more difficult. So if they had a band and a buoy, take off the band, things are going to be a little bit easier. Or if they're only using a band, you can take away the band, and that's also going to make things a lot easier. So just manipulating the training aids is a great way to change the challenge as well. If swimmers are using resistance, simply lighten the load or even perhaps eliminate it altogether. Sometimes it's just a little bit too heavy. Getting rid of that resistance allows them to be successful. And finally, you can change the training tasks that you're asking them to do. So if you're doing drills that are particularly challenging or particularly complicated or particularly difficult, taking a step back and using a different drill can often allow swimmers to be successful. Those are the basic levers that you can pull to change the difficulty of a set. And so now I'd like to give you a couple of different overall strategies about how to think about doing so. So if you're going to make a set easier because they're not being successful, or you just want to make sure one individual or a couple individuals are successful, it makes a lot more sense to make it a lot easier. So instead of just making it slightly easier, make it a lot easier. Because if you only make it slightly easier, they still may fail again. They still may struggle again. And so it's better off to just overdo it, make sure that they're successful. And once they're successful, you can start adding things back in if you'd like. So rather than just trying to work your way backwards and having them keep failing and keep failing and keep failing, just set them up, do something that you know they'll be successful with. And then if you want, you can start to add things back in. You're going to get the change much faster, and you're going to do it without the consequences of potentially damaging their confidence if they're continuing to fail. That's something you want to avoid. You want them to be successful as soon as you can. So again, if you're stepping things down, try to make that change pretty drastic so you know they can be successful. And then if necessary, you can increase the challenge as you go through the set, or just increase the challenge over time. Now, if you're trying to make the set more difficult, I suggest you only make one change of all those different parameters we talked about. Just change one thing and make it slightly more difficult. Because sometimes swimmers can be really successful, looking really good, and then you just push them a little bit more and it all kind of falls apart. And so you're much better off doing just a little bit more, and then just a little bit more, and then just a little bit more over time, rather than just trying to make a big push. And if you try to make a change in 3 or 4 things, that can really overwhelm them and make it a lot more difficult than you thought it was, and that's not something you want to do. Because you're working on what's important the entire year, you don't have to make huge changes from workout to workout. You've got enough time to make progress. So it's a lot better to be conservative when you're adding difficulty so that you continue to set them up for success. Last strategy, prioritize what's important. So let's say you're doing a set where they have a speed requirement and a stroke count requirement, and an athlete's struggling. If the stroke count is more important, then you'd back off on the speed. But if the speed is more important, then you'd back off on the stroke count. If you're scaling things down, you're trying to reduce in areas that allow for the main priority to be successful. And so if you really want them to do a drill really well, then maybe you're going to give them more rest or reduce the distances so they can do that drill really well, rather than changing the drill and keeping the set the same. So it's always about whatever is the priority, you protect that and you make the changes in other areas. Likewise, if you're going to make something more difficult, well, what's the area that you want to focus on? If you're trying to challenge them physiologically, maybe you just do less rest. That's going to make it more difficult. Or if you want them to focus on being able to hold skills for longer periods of time, you can increase the repetition distance. If you're looking to build strength, you can increase the resistance. If you're looking for efficiency, increase the stroke count restrictions or the stroke count requirements. So you're just focusing on what you want to improve the most in the next step, and then that's where you're making your adjustment. So let's take an example set. 10 100s on 130, they're going to descend 1 to 5 at the same stroke count and then descend again 6 to 10. Simple, straightforward set. So how could you make that more difficult? You could have them go for longer distances. So they could go 10 150s. You could reduce the interval. Now it's on 120. You could ask for more speed. So say you gave them the goal of going under 110 or whatever. Now they have to hold under 105. You could change the stroke count. They typically take 12. You could reduce it down to 11. You can increase the number of repetitions, the total volume. You can go 15 100s instead. You could change the training aid, so you could add a buoy, but then you ask them to still swim the same times and the same stroke counts. Or you could start asking them to take dolphin kicks, and now they have to take 6 dolphin kicks every wall, or whatever would be appropriate. So those are all versions of the same basic set. You've made it more difficult in some way to challenge swimmers more from either technical or a physical perspective. If you want to make it easier, you could bump up the interval to 140. You could reduce the repetition distance. Now we're going maybe 1275, so the volume is pretty similar. You could have them focus on speed or stroke count and not both. Or you could just reduce the requirements for either speed or stroke count, so you can allow them to swim a little bit slower. You could allow them to take a couple extra strokes. You could reduce the total volume, so you could only do 6 or 8 of these hundreds instead. Or you could have them throw on fins and keep the basic requirements the same. That's going to make it easier as well. And so with both situations, there's almost unlimited possibilities. It's just a matter of focusing on what you want to improve and what you think makes the most sense. And then simply watch and see what happens. If your change accomplishes the goals you were hoping for, you're good to go. If it's not, then you probably have to make another adjustment. So, quick summary. To make a set more difficult, pick one way to make it more difficult that prioritizes what you want to improve in the next version of the set. If you want to make things easier, you probably want to change several things or one thing dramatically to ensure that they're successful. And then once they're successful, you can slowly start to increase the challenge either within that set or over time. So the ability to make these modifications is really key skill in coaching, because even if you write really great sets, no set is going to be perfect for every one of your swimmers. And so you have to be able to adjust this, and you have to be able to manage it both on the day and over time. And when you do, you'll see that you get much more consistent results with all of your swimmers because they're getting what they need. And when they get what they need, they tend to be successful. When they're successful, they work harder. So it's a nice positive feed-forward cycle where they just keep getting better and better. Hope that helps. Do you have any follow-ups? Let me know. And as always, keep it simple.